He saw a woman in a wheelchair clearing tables and decided she was an easy target. A broken soldier in a dead-end job. What he didn't see, what his ignorant eyes could never comprehend, was the warrior who had earned the call sign Valkyrie in the deadliest valley in Afghanistan. He thought he was poking a wounded lamb. He was about to find out he'd just kicked a sleeping lion. His mistake wouldn't just cost him his pride. It would awaken a code of honor that had slumbered in their small town for far too long. The voice belonged to a man whose leather vest was stretched tight over a beer gut. A patch reading "Ripper" stitched over his heart. He and his two companions laughed, a sound like gravel churning in a cement mixer. Their laughter was a declaration of ownership, a flag planted in the center of the quiet, unassuming diner. And it was all pointed at the woman in the corner. Her name was Anya Sharma, and she didn't flinch. She just continued her task, wiping down a table with a cloth, her movements economical and precise. If you watched her hands, you'd see the story of her life. They were strong, steady, scarred across the knuckles, but they moved with the grace of a surgeon. They could break a man's jaw or set a dislocated bone with equal skill. Right now, they were wiping away a sticky ring of syrup left by a child's pancake breakfast. Her focus was absolute. To an observer, she was just a cleaner. But to those who knew the language of discipline, she was something else entirely. The Iron Skillet Diner, nestled in a small town in the heartland, was her sanctuary. It wasn't pretty. The vinyl on the booths was cracked like old skin, and the coffee was perpetually on the verge of being burnt. But it was predictable. It was order. And for Anya, order was peace. She had traded the chaos of the Korangal Valley for the simple clatter of plates and silverware. She had earned this quiet. Around her neck, tucked just under the collar of her worn flannel shirt, hung a chain. On it was a single, heavy bronze coin, worn smooth from years of contact with her skin. A challenge coin from her old unit. On one side, a skull wearing a green beret. On the other, the words, "De oppresso liber," to free the oppressed. It was a reminder, a promise. Ripper and his crew, a lanky one called Slide, and a hulking giant known only as Brick, slid into a booth, their movements loud and careless. They weren't here for the food. They were here for the attention. Ripper's eyes, small and mean, found Anya again. His gaze slid down to her legs. One was muscled and strong, clad in denim. The other was a state-of-the-art carbon fiber prosthetic from the knee down. He smirked. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "You lose that in a bar fight, or did Uncle Sam send you home in pieces?" Slide snickered. Probably tripped over her own feet trying to keep up with the men. Anya finished wiping the table. She turned, her wheelchair moving silently across the checkered linoleum. Her eyes were calm, a deep, steady brown that seemed to absorb the light in the room. She looked directly at Ripper, not with anger, but with a quiet, unnerving assessment. It was the look a master mechanic gives a faulty engine trying to diagnose the problem. The look of a professional. "The special today is meatloaf," she said, her voice even. "Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans." The sheer, unexpected professionalism of it threw Ripper off for a second. He recovered quickly, his sneer deepening. He was a man who thrived on reaction, and her lack of it was an insult to his power. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl, but loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I know your type," he said, "all gung-ho, waving the flag. But I bet you never saw a damn thing. Probably pushed paper at some desk in Germany while the real soldiers were fighting." He paused, looking for a reaction and finding none. I was in, you know. Almost a ranger. Would have made it too if it weren't for all the pencil pushers and their regulations. In a corner booth, a 10-year-old boy named Leo watched, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. His comic book lay forgotten on the table. He was fascinated by soldiers, and the woman with the steady eyes and the quiet strength was more real than any superhero in his comics. He looked at his grandfather, who sat across from him. "Grandpa," he whispered, "are they being mean to her?" Mr. Peterson didn't answer. He was a thin, wiry man with a face like a roadmap of long, hard years. A Vietnam veteran. He'd come home from Da Nang in '71 and hadn't spoken a word about it since. Not to his wife, not to his son, not to his grandson. He just watched, his eyes missing nothing. A lifetime of observation packed into his silent gaze. He saw the bikers, he saw Anya, and he saw the other patrons in the diner, the couple pretending to read their menus, the waitress suddenly fascinated with the coffee machine, the trucker staring out the window. An entire room full of people choosing to be invisible. A silence he knew all too well. Anya placed the menus on the bikers' table, one for each of them. Her movements were still deliberate, controlled. She was not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. She was denying them their power, and that made them furious. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, lady," Slide snapped, reaching out as if to grab her arm. Anya's chair rolled back a few inches, just out of his reach, a micro-movement so quick and instinctive it was almost invisible. The move of someone who had spent years mastering the geometry of survival. The move of a warrior. This was the first spark in the silence, a silent challenge that everyone felt. The quiet diner was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield. And the first casualty is always innocence. If you believe courage isn't about the noise you make, but the silence you keep, hit that subscribe button and join the NX Incredible Stories family. We believe these stories need to be told. Ripper saw the movement. He saw it as defiance. He stood up slowly, a predator cornering his prey. The flimsy pretense of conversation was gone. Now it was just about power, about breaking something that refused to bend. "You think you're better than us?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step toward her wheelchair, his shadow falling over her. The whole diner held its breath. Mr. Peterson put his hand on his grandson's shoulder, a silent signal to stay put. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of what was to come. The quiet was about to break. Ripper's shadow was a physical weight. He crowded Anya, invading her space, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and cigarettes. "I'm talking to you," he repeated, his voice a low growl. The other customers shrank in their booths, their world narrowing to the bottom of a coffee cup or the pattern on the wallpaper. This was the bystander effect in real time, a collective retreat into self-preservation. But Anya didn't retreat. She held his gaze, her posture unchanged. She'd faced men far more dangerous than him, in places where the stakes were infinitely higher. His aggression was a language she understood perfectly. It was the desperate roar of a man who mistakes intimidation for strength. A man whose own failures had curdled into a permanent, bitter rage. Ripper had been an army washout, booted from ranger selection for failing to follow orders, for a deep-seated instability that even the military couldn't stomach. He saw in her composure, in her quiet dignity, everything he wasn't. He saw the honor he could never earn, and he hated her for it. "You think that leg makes you special?" he sneered, gesturing with his chin toward her prosthetic. "Makes you a hero? You're just broken. a piece of damaged government property. The words were meant to shatter her, to find a crack in her armor. But as he spoke, Anya's focus shifted inward. The greasy smell of the diner faded, the hum of the refrigerator disappeared. The present dissolved into the searing heat and choking dust of the past. The world was noise and fire. The rhythmic thud of a 50 cal pounded from a nearby Humvee. The air tasted of cordite and hot metal. Anya, then Sergeant Sharma, Callsign Valkyrie, was on her knees behind the ruined wall of a compound. A young private, a kid named Miller, barely out of his teens, was on the ground in front of her, his leg a mangled ruin from a pressure plate IED. Blood pulsed from his femoral artery, soaking the dust dark red. "It's okay, Miller. It's okay. Look at me," she said, her voice a bedrock of calm in the hurricane of combat. Her hands moved with a life of their own, pulling a tourniquet from her kit, cinching it high and tight on his thigh. "I can't feel my legs, Sarge," he screamed, his eyes wide with panic. A Taliban fighter leaned out from a window 100 yards away, the muzzle of his AK-47 flashing. Bullets stitched the dirt just inches from Anya's head. She didn't even look up. Her entire world was the wounded soldier in front of her. "That's because I've got it," she said, her voice never wavering as she twisted the windlass on the tourniquet, cutting off the flow of blood. "Your leg is fine. Your job right now is to breathe. My job is everything else. You got me. Breathe, son." She had stayed with him, shielding his body with her own, returning fire with her sidearm when she had to, until the medevac chopper roared overhead. She had saved his life while ignoring the threat to her own. That was the core of her being. The discipline forged in fire. The diner snapped back into focus. Ripper was still talking, his face contorted with rage. But his words were just noise now, as meaningless as buzzing flies. She had faced real bullets. His words were nothing. This utter lack of reaction was the final insult. It was a complete denial of his power. In a blinding flash of fury, Ripper drew back his foot, clad in a heavy biker boot, and kicked the large wheel of her chair. Not a tip, a kick. A violent, deliberate act of assault. The chair spun sideways, the frame groaning in protest. The smaller front wheel caught on a crack in the floor, and the chair overturned. Time seemed to slow down. Anya fell, not with a scream, but with a controlled grunt, twisting her body to take the impact on her shoulder and hip, a drill she'd practiced 1,000 times. But the hard, unforgiving floor of the diner was not a padded gym mat. Pain, white-hot and brilliant, flared through her hip as the metal socket of the prosthetic dug into her bone. Her world was a jumble of overturned tables and shocked faces, and then the sound. The clatter of her wallet hitting the floor, spilling its contents. A few dollars, a driver's license, and the heavy bronze challenge coin which skittered across the floor, spinning like a top before coming to rest a few inches from the boot of Mr. Peterson. Leo, the boy, gasped. He looked at the coin, its strange skull and beret gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Mr. Peterson's eyes locked onto it. He didn't need to read the Latin. He knew what it was. It was a totem, a piece of a sacred tribe. It represented a debt that could never be fully repaid, a bond forged in shared hardship and sacrifice. His own past, a ghost he had wrestled with in silence for 50 years, rose up within him. He remembered the looks on people's faces when he came home, the cold shoulders, the quiet accusations, the feeling of being an outsider in his own country. He had buried it all, built a quiet life, raised a family. But seeing Anya on the floor, seeing that coin, the walls he had built around his heart for half a century began to crumble. Ripper and his crew were laughing now. A low, ugly sound. They had gotten what they wanted. A reaction. They had broken the stillness. They had put the hero on the floor. But Mr. Peterson was no longer seeing a stranger. He was seeing a sister in arms, a fellow traveler from that other world of pain and duty. He had chosen silence for 50 years, but silence, he now realized, was a form of complicity. It was a choice, and he was about to make a new one. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down and picked up the coin. He held its weight in his palm. It felt familiar. He looked at Anya as she began to push herself up, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a cold fire. He didn't help her. He knew she wouldn't want him to. Her pride was the only thing they hadn't taken. Instead, he stood up. His movements were stiff, but filled with a new, rediscovered purpose. He walked past the bikers, who barely gave him a glance. He pushed open the diner door, stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, and pulled out an old, flip-style cell phone. He scrolled through a list of names he hadn't looked at in years. He found the one he was looking for and pressed the call button. When a voice answered on the other end, Mr. Peterson's own voice was raspy from disuse, but steady as a rock. "Gunny," he said. "It's Peterson. Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, I'm at the Iron Skillet on Route 4. We've got a problem. One of ours is down." He paused, his gaze fixed on the diner window, on Anya, now back in her chair, dignified and defiant amidst the mess. "No, not a firefight. A different kind of war. But it's an emergency. You need to spin up the chain. Now. 30 minutes can be an eternity." Inside the Iron Skillet, time stretched and warped, thick with a tension that was more suffocating than the smell of stale grease. The bikers, flush with their perceived victory, had grown louder. Ripper had his boots propped up on a table, laughing as Slide told a crude joke. They had shattered the peace, and now they were dancing in the ruins. They had made their point. They were strong, and the woman in the wheelchair was weak. They owned this room. Anya sat at her cleared table in the corner. The waitress, a teenager named Chloe, had silently come over with a damp cloth. Their eyes met for a second, a fleeting moment of shared humanity. Chloe didn't say anything, but her gesture was a small act of rebellion against the ugliness that had taken over her diner. It was a tiny spark. Anya had given her a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. She sat upright, her spine straight, her hands resting in her lap. She wasn't looking at the bikers. She was looking at the clock on the wall, as if waiting for a scheduled event, a rendezvous she knew was coming. She was a soldier, and a soldier knows that after the battle comes the report. After the assault comes the response. She was waiting. Mr. Peterson had returned to his table. He sat with his grandson Leo, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. He hadn't said a word, but his entire demeanor had changed. The quiet, almost invisible old man was gone. In his place was someone with presence, his back straighter, his eyes alert and watchful. He was on overwatch. The first sign of change was not a sound, but a shift in the light. A vehicle had blocked the afternoon sun, casting a long shadow through the diner's front window. It wasn't a police car with flashing lights or a military Humvee. It was a dusty, black Ford F-150, the kind of truck you'd see on any farm or construction site in the country. It pulled into the gravel lot and parked, not in a space, but directly in front of the entrance, blocking the bikers' motorcycles. The engine cut, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The diner door opened. 3 men stepped inside. They weren't in uniform. They were middle-aged, dressed in the ordinary clothes of working men. Worn jeans, flannel shirts, sturdy boots. But they didn't move like ordinary men. They moved with a shared, unspoken rhythm, a quiet economy of motion that spoke of years of training and absolute trust in one another. They didn't scan the room. They assessed it, their eyes taking in the bikers, the silent customers, and finally, Anya. The man in the lead was built like a blacksmith, with a graying flat top and hands that looked like they could crush stone. He was the Marine Gunny Mr. Peterson had called. To his right was a leaner man with the coiled intensity of a whipsnake, an Army Ranger. To his left, a man with a calm, watchful face and a paramedic's patch on the sleeve of his jacket, a former Air Force pararescue man, a PJ. They were three different branches of the same family, three parts of the same unbreakable chain. The laughter from the biker's table died instantly. Ripper swung his boots off the table, his face a mask of confusion and sudden unease. These weren't cops. They weren't kids looking for a fight. They were something else, something he recognized on a primal level from his own failed past. They were professionals. The three men ignored the bikers completely. They walked directly to Anya's table. The gunny stopped in front of her. He looked at her, at the stains on her shirt, at the fierce, unshakable dignity in her eyes. He didn't offer a salute. This wasn't a formal occasion. He did something more meaningful. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, absolute respect. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried across the silent room. He used her old call sign. It was a name, a title, a piece of her history she thought had been buried in the dust of Afghanistan. Hearing it spoken aloud in this greasy diner was like a flag being raised in her soul. "We got your six." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as the ground beneath their feet. The ranger stepped forward slightly. He looked over at Ripper, his eyes cold and flat. "Sergeant Sharma pulled my entire fire team out of an ambush in the Tangi Valley," he said, his voice calm, conversational, but with an edge of hardened steel. "She did it with a busted radio and a gunshot wound to the shoulder. So, a piece of advice. You need to re-evaluate the person you're dealing with." The PJ added his part. "That leg she's missing? She got that dragging our pilot out of a downed Black Hawk. The bird was on fire. She went back in. 3 times. The stories landed in the diner like thunderclaps. They weren't accusations. They were testimonials. They were painting a picture for everyone to see. A portrait of a hero, sitting right there among them. The bikers stared, their bluster evaporating, replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding. They hadn't been punching down at a victim. They had been punching up at a giant. This was the moment the tide turned completely. What does the word honor mean to you? Let us know in the comments below, because in this room, its meaning was becoming crystal clear. Mr. Peterson stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked over to Anya's table and placed the challenge coin gently in her hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside the other 3 men. A Vietnam Army veteran standing with a Marine Gunny, an Army Ranger, and an Air Force PJ. 4 different wars, 4 different uniforms, one single unshakable code. Inspired by his action, a man at the counter in a John Deere hat slowly rose to his feet. Then a woman near the window. Within a minute, half the people in the diner were standing, not in applause, but in a silent, powerful vigil. They were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses. They were a community finding its backbone. Ripper looked from the silent patrons to the 4 figures standing by the wheelchair, and finally to Anya. Her face was serene. She looked down at the coin in her palm, then back up at the Gunny. For the first time all day, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. The bikers were no longer the center of attention. They were irrelevant. They were just three loud, angry men in a room that no longer belonged to them. The battle was over. It had been won without a single punch thrown. The silence that defeated the bikers was absolute. Stripped of their audience and their bravado, they were just three angry men in a room full of ghosts they couldn't fight. Ripper opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. Slide fumbled for his wallet, threw a few crumpled bills on the table for coffee they'd barely touched, and they shuffled out of the diner, their heads down. They didn't look back. The sound of their motorcycles starting up was different this time. Not a roar of defiance, but a hurried, sputtering retreat. Later that week, a new story started making the rounds in town. Ripper and his crew had walked into their usual biker-friendly bar on the outskirts of town. The owner, a barrel-chested man named Sal, who had 2 tours in Iraq with the 1st Cavalry under his belt, met them at the door. "Heard what you boys did over at the Skillet," Sal said, his voice dangerously calm as he wiped the bar with a rag. "We don't serve your kind here. Your credit's no good. Not now, not ever." He pointed to a sign behind the bar, hand-painted and simple. "Respect is earned, not demanded." Actions have consequences, and the bikers were learning their actions had made them outsiders in their own town. Back at the Iron Skillet, the transformation was already underway. The incident hadn't broken the diner. It had reforged it. Mr. Peterson, the quiet Vietnam vet, had found his voice after 50 years of silence. The following Saturday, he put a small notice in the local paper. It read, "Veterans Coffee, Iron Skillet Diner. Saturdays, 800 hours. All who served, all eras, are welcome. Your first cup is on me." The first week, 5 people showed up. A Korean War vet, a young woman who'd just finished her Navy enlistment, and a couple who had served in Desert Storm. And Mr. Peterson. They didn't talk about war. They talked about grandkids, about fishing, about the trouble with modern cars. But they were together. The next week, there were 10, then 20. The diner, once just a place for a quick meal, had become a sanctuary, a meeting ground. The owner, moved by the change, officially renamed the diner. A new hand-carved wooden sign went up out front. The Iron Skillet, home of the Veterans Breakfast Club. All are welcome. Anya's life changed most of all. The walls she had built around herself started to come down. The Gunny, whose name was Mike, had asked her a simple question before he left that day. "Valkyrie, the new recruits at the local guard unit could use someone to talk to. Someone who's been there. Someone to teach them what the uniform really means." She had said yes. Every other Thursday, Anya would go to the armory. She didn't talk about glory or battles. She talked about teamwork, about discipline, about the sacred duty of looking out for the person next to you. She taught them that strength wasn't about being the toughest, but about being the most reliable. She used her own story, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a lesson in resilience. The young soldiers looked at her prosthetic leg, and her unshakable calm. And they saw not weakness, but a roadmap for how to be strong. She had found a new purpose, a new squad to lead. One Saturday morning, months later, Anya sat at her usual table at the Iron Skillet, now surrounded by the lively chatter of the Veterans Breakfast Club. Mr. Peterson was telling his grandson Leo a story, not about combat, but about the crazy heat and the monsoon rains of Vietnam. Leo was listening, his eyes wide, finally getting to know the hero who had been his grandfather all along. The door opened, and a young man in a crisp new army uniform stepped in. He clutched his cap in his hands, his face a mixture of pride and terror. He was shipping out for his first deployment the next day. He stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do. Anya wheeled herself over. Her movements were smooth and confident. The old hesitation was gone. "First tour, soldier?" she asked, her voice warm. He nodded, speechless. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the empty chair at her table. "Coffee's hot. The company's better. Your family here." As the young man sat, Mike the Gunny raised his coffee cup from across the room. Mr. Peterson did the same. Around the diner, mugs were quietly lifted in a silent, universal toast. It was a message passed without words. You are not alone. We see you. We have your six. This, right here, is the unbreakable code. It isn't written in any military manual or chiseled onto any monument. It's a silent promise forged in shared sacrifice, carried in the hearts of those who have served. It's the promise that says, you are not forgotten. Your fight is my fight. Your honor is my honor. Ripper and his crew only understood the language of brute force, but the men who answered the call that day spoke a language far more powerful. The language of loyalty. They didn't need to throw a punch. Their presence was a testament. Their stories were the verdict. That echo of honor didn't end when they left the diner. It rippled outwards. It transformed a quiet Vietnam vet into a community leader. It turned a grieving combat medic into a mentor for the next generation. It reminded an entire town that the quiet neighbors they see every day might just be the giants who once held the world on their shoulders. Perhaps you know a Mr. Peterson in your own life, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor who holds a universe of stories in his silence. Perhaps you've seen an Anya, someone whose quiet dignity is a shield against the world's casual cruelty. This story is a reminder that we all have a role to play in upholding that code. It's the choice to see beyond the surface, to offer a hand, to make a call, or to simply stand in silent solidarity. It is the choice to be a witness, not a bystander. If this story reminded you of the giants who walk among us, share it. Let this echo of honor be heard. And for more incredible stories that celebrate the unbreakable spirit of service, make sure you subscribe to NX Incredible Stories and join our community. Because the unbreakable code doesn't just belong to them. It belongs to all of us who choose to remember and respect it.